Golden Chains and Silver Chords, written by Becca Lewis, copyright 1988. Audio read by Becca Lewis, copyright 2020. Once upon a time, there was a very handsome and proud bullfrog that lived on a lily pad in the middle of a large silver lake. He was known throughout all the land as the frog with the prettiest skin and the most beautiful eyes, and he was very proud of both. He was very careful about the way he looked. He would never venture out onto the pad until he was sure he looked his best with a perfect bow tie to match his mood. This frog was looked up to by many of the other frogs in the lake because he always knew the right thing to say. They admired and envied his wide-mouthed grin. All the lady frogs adored him. They loved to stare into his large, lovely blue-green eyes and imagine that he loved them the most. They felt very lucky when he would invite them over at night to dance with him on his lily pad while he sang gentle songs into their ears. However, when he was alone, which wasn't very often, he would practice his favorite sport of jumping. Of course, all frogs love to jump, but this frog was especially happy when he could jump alone at night on his own pad. He was sure that someday it would bring him all the attention he desired. However, until then, he did it because it always made him feel wonderful. He would crouch as low as he could, and with all the power that he could muster, push off into the night, leaping for the moon and sailing through the sky. One night, as he jumped, he saw an awesome sight. Far off in the distance, he noticed another jumping frog. It was hard for him to imagine, let alone admit, but it seemed as if the frog was actually jumping higher than he could. Now, although Handsome Bullfrog was jumping for the joy of it, he was also jumping for the glory of it. And to have a frog jump higher, well, it was unheard of, and definitely something to be upset about. Perhaps it is just my imagination or a fluke, he thought. He prayed, I won't worry about it at all. The next night he was out on his lily pad jumping again, leaping for the moon and sailing through the sky when, what? He saw it again. Now this is too much, he declared. It's time for me to find out the truth of that jumping frog, and if he is jumping higher than I am, I will learn his secret so I will still be the best jumping frog in the land. Now, Handsome Bullfrog had never been out of his own pond before. There had been no need to, for up to this time he had been quite content to be well known and adored in his own home. However, to learn the secret of this rival frog, he would have to go off on an adventure. That, if the truth was told, frightened him quite a bit. Unfortunately, being a proud frog meant that he could not admit that he was afraid. He could not even admit that he wasn't quite sure where to find the other pond. Hoping for the best, he left early the next morning in the direction he had last seen the midnight leaper, as he had taken to calling the rival frog. For days he traveled through the marsh and through the meadows. Sometimes he would become discouraged, but the thought of the adoration and the personal pleasure he would receive once he learned how to jump higher drove him on. At last, days later, he tumbled into a lake. Finding himself at loose ends and with no idea where he was, he decided to take a well-earned long nap. He found a nice lily pad and closed his eyes. When he opened them, it was night, and the moon was shining through a tiny hole in a very cloudy sky. It took a while for his eyes to adjust, but once they did, he was astonished to see that not far from where he lay, the midnight leaper was jumping. In spite of himself, he was overcome with amazement at the power of the frog, It looked as if she, as he was surprised to find the Midnight Leaper was a lady frog, was actually leaping almost to the moon. For moments, she would become suspended in the sky with the clouds laid out gently beneath her. As he watched, all the feelings of trying to be the best sleeping frog in the world melted away from him. The feelings of excitement and wonder overcame the desire to be the best and feel adored. Now, all he wanted to know was how to leap as high as she was leaping, because at the moment he felt that he could do anything, that all things are possible and allowed and even easy. For hours he watched. The Midnight Leaper never tired. Finally, as the sun came up over the edge of the pond, she stopped and turned to the handsome bullfrog. "Hello," she said. "Do you care to join me?" Overcome with emotion, he could only nod yes. "What do I need to do?" he was finally able to ask. "Take off your gold chains of the past and the silver cord of adoration," she answered. "Gold chains? Silver cords? What gold chains and silver cords?" he croaked at her impatiently. "The ones that tie you down," she replied. "The gold chains that bind your legs and your feet, and finally, the silver cord that circles your neck." Looking at himself, he could see nothing. Still, he was willing to remove them if it enabled him to leap higher. For the next 2 weeks, he practiced sleeping with his friend, the Midnight Leaper. Yet every night she was able to leap higher and higher. He asked her why she could always go higher while he stayed the same. She replied in a very gentle but clear and firm voice, "I am always taking off my golden chains and loosening the silver cord." Since he could not see golden chains or silver cords on either of them, he found the answer only upset him. Sometimes it made him angry, and sometimes he didn't listen. But most of the time, he kept on trying. Whatever it takes, he decided, I'm willing to do. However, trying as hard as he could, he was still not able to go higher than he had before. "Keep leaping," she encouraged, "until you feel the golden chains and the silver cord." He kept leaping. Sometimes he felt that he could go no more, and many nights he wanted to stay curled up inside his new lily pad home. But the thought of a new freedom and the feeling of leaping to the moon kept him going. Finally, after weeks of tiresome leaping, he felt a tug as he pushed off. He pushed off again and felt another. "I feel the golden chains," he cried, and the residents of the pond who had been watching every night joined him in a loud croak of delight. The first step had begun. He felt the tug of the chains that held him to earth and kept him from soaring to the sky. Now, even though he could not see the chains, he could feel them and was able to reach down as he leaped and pull them off. For many weeks, he pulled the chains off one by one until he no longer could feel any tugs, and he could leap higher than he had ever leaped before. He was beside himself with joy. "I can leap over the trees," he sang. "I can fly with the birds in the air." Because he could leap higher than he had ever leaped before and felt better than he could ever have imagined, he forgot to watch and listen to his friend, the Midnight Leaper. He did not notice that every night that went by, she took longer to come down from her leap. He was satisfied with himself. The day came when he decided to return to his own pond. All his new friends wished him well. He and the Midnight Leaper had become best friends, and both their eyes filled with tears as he prepared to go on his journey. "Leap with me at night from where you are," she asked. "We can leap to the moon together and teach our friends how to leap to new heights." He responded by kissing her, His voice shook as he said, "I will never forget you and all that you taught me. Someday I will come back, and we will leap together again." On his last day, he accepted a gift from her of a new bow tie that matched his eyes. As he hopped away, he turned and straightened his tie. He did not see her tears as she waved goodbye. The return trip was short because on one of his high leaps he had seen the path to home. It turned out to be only a half-day's journey away. "Knowing where I am going helps a lot," he decided. He vowed to himself to teach others the trick of leaping and rising above the trees to find their path. When he returned home, Handsome Bullfrog became quite a hero for having been on such an adventure. The night he leapt for the whole pond, oh, the adoration and the glamour that followed. It was too much. He loved it all. Every night he leapt for a loving audience, and every night he forgot to turn to the direction of the pond where the Midnight Leaper lived and jump with her. Because he wasn't looking, he didn't notice her watching and waiting for him. Each night she leaped higher, and each night she looked to see if he would follow. He didn't. It wasn't until many months later, on a very dark and stormy night, that he remembered what he had promised. Of course, he only remembered because none of his friends had come out to watch him jump that night. It was much too cold. Looking for some attention, he turned this way and that on his pad and finally noticed the Midnight Leaper. She had just leaped as he turned and was on a very long ascent into the sky. Many minutes went by before she started to come down. She noticed him watching and waved. Soon they were jumping together, he in his pond and the Midnight Leaper in her pond. It was clear that she had been practicing while he had been playing, because her leaps were so much higher than his. The Handsome Bullfrog was embarrassed and angry with himself. With the strength of his determination, he leapt again and was violently yanked to the ground by a tug on his neck. He had finally felt the silver cord. Lying breathlessly on his pad, he watched as she leapt one more time. He watched as she went higher and higher, waving to him as she went, and with a final kiss blown to him through the air, the Midnight Leaper floated above the sky until only her eyes shone down on him as two new stars in the night. With tears of sorrow and joy filling his beautiful eyes, he watched her go. As he cried, he felt the silver cord melt away. At last, he was free. He began to practice again. If his friends in the pond were watching, he was glad, not because he was proud of himself, but because he knew that it helped them to feel what he had felt when he had first seen the Midnight Leaper. He knew they would soon begin to leap for themselves. Every night he practiced, alone at first, and then with his friends. He taught them how to find the golden chains and the silver cord. Each night he leapt higher and higher. It wasn't too many full moons later that he took the final long leap and blew his last kiss to his friends on the ground as he soared above the sky. His friends watched and cheered as his eyes joined the Midnight Leapers as stars in the night. Even today, if you look up at night, you will see their eyes twinkling as beacons of promise to those leaping below on their way to the sky. The end. Golden Chains and Silver Cords, written by Becca Lewis, 1988. Golden Chains and Silver Cords, audio, read by Becca Lewis, 2020. Love's Silent, Sweet Secret, written by Becca Lewis, copyright 1988. Audio by Becca Lewis, copyright 2018. Love's silent, sweet secret. Once upon a time, there lived a husband and wife who were excellent friends. Their names were Agatha and Winston. Agatha was a small, very round gray bear who loved to amble through flower gardens, smelling the flowers and petting the bees. Winston was a tall, rather saggy, and unstuffed brown bear. This unstuffedness caused him to look a little shaky, but once one got to know him, they would find that he was quite dignified and precise. Some of their friends could not understand how Agatha and Winston became such good friends, or why they were married. After all, it seemed as if they were nothing alike and had nothing in common. Besides, it was clear that Agatha was much sillier than Winston. The gossip was that Winston only kept Agatha around to have a good laugh when he was alone. These people were foolish friends, if one could call them friends. They didn't understand the silent, sweet secret shared by Agatha and Winston. Their shared secret kept them awake at night with delight and made them laugh out loud in the day. This wonderful secret kept them such sound friends that they never once argued. They loved each other for exactly who and what they were. Winston loved Agatha's round, slow plumpness and the way that she could stand so firm, even if the wind was blowing hard enough to bend strong trees. Agatha loved Winston's unstuffedness, as it made it easy for her to put her short, pudgy arms around him. She loved how gentle and dignified he was, even as he put on his robe and slippers at night and brushed his teeth. All in all, they were happy with each other and with themselves. One day, a visitor rang their doorbell and everything changed. The night before she arrived, they both had an uneasy feeling. Neither of them mentioned it to the other. Agatha decided it was just a slight reaction to trying out the new nasturtium jam recipe that she had just made. She thought that she might have added a touch too much mint. Winston thought it was due to his disappointment in a new book by his favorite author that wasn't quite as good as he had expected. Later, they decided that it would have been a good idea to discuss their uneasy feelings with each other, rather than coming up with reasons to explain them away. Perhaps in this way, they could have prevented the events that were to come. The visitor arrived just before tea time, Winston's favorite time of the day. He loved setting the tea table while Agatha prepared delicate round butter cookies. When the doorbell rang, Agatha asked Winston in her smooth, soft voice, "Are you expecting anyone?" He answered with his slight English accent that he was not. Cautiously, they went to the door and peeped through the keyhole. On the other side of the door was a young woman dressed in a simple white dress and a blue shawl with delicate lace around the edge. She waved to them, so Agatha and Winston opened the door and invited her in for tea, curious about why the young woman had come to see them. While they munched on the warm cookies, their visitor told them that the local flower shop had asked her to visit Agatha. Agatha was so well known for her green thumb. The flower shop wanted to see if Agatha would be interested in showing one of her prize roses at the flower show to be held at the local park. The date was set for the next month, and gardeners from all the local towns had been invited. Agatha let out an involuntary yip of delight and astonishment. Although she was quite proud of her rose garden, it had never occurred to her to show the roses she had developed. The invitation was wonderful, and she answered, "Yes, yes, I would be delighted." Winston was so proud of Agatha that his chest swelled out just enough to strain one of the brass buttons on his plaid vest to the popping point. It was evident that everyone was delighted. Winston asked for more tea and cookies to celebrate, and Agatha giggled as she poured. Winston and Agatha were so excited that they never thought to ask their visitor which flower shop had sent her. The invitation sounded so grand and important that they were caught up in the moment. After the events that occurred, they agreed that it would have been best to find out all the facts before they accepted the invitation. Instead, they had a rather pleasant afternoon talking about roses and reveling in all sorts of intellectual discourse. Winston tried to explain his theory of the relationship of the movement of the stars and the movement of the smallest elements on Earth to Agatha and their young visitor. In his beautiful, cultured English voice, he would say such phrases as, "Everything affects everything." Agatha would nod and add her comments. These afternoon discussions always kept them on their mental toes, and that afternoon their conversation was heightened because of their excitement. Each of them was bubbling over by the time the visitor bid them a good day and left them to their quiet evening by the fire. That night, however, was entirely different. Agatha became adamant about how she wanted to show her rose and exactly whom she wanted to invite to the event. Her plans grew bigger and bigger. She spent the entire evening discussing how long she had worked on her flowers and how beautiful they were, and how much work it would take to get them ready, and really on into the night. Winston, with his quiet, gentle ways, could not bring a measure of peace to the conversation. Finally, he slowly rose from his chair and made his floppy but dignified way to bed. Agatha didn't really notice that Winston had gone. She was too busy planning how she would win the prize. It was many more hours before she went to sleep. Visions of grandeur and glory kept her awake most of the night. The next day was more of the same. She had no time to prepare a warm breakfast for Winston or to take time for a morning sun nap for herself. Work had to be done on the flower bed. After all, she told herself, the show is only a few weeks away. When Winston came out into the yard later that afternoon with a cool and lovely lemonade drink for Agatha, she thanked him briskly and waved him away. As Winston walked away, he glanced over his shoulder at Agatha. He hoped that she had realized how uncaring she had just been to him. Instead, he saw Agatha busy digging around the bushes, throwing dirt into the grass as she did so. This was not at all like her normally neat ways. He was also saddened to see that although there were many yellow fuzzy bees around the flowers, Agatha was not taking time to pet any of them. They, like him, were slowly moving away, he to the house, and they to other gardens. The next 4 weeks were not happy weeks either for Agatha or Winston. Agatha could not stop thinking what it would be like to be the winner of the flower show award. All of her time was spent in the garden working. She did not smell the flowers, and she was certainly not petting the few remaining bees. She was working. When she wasn't in the garden working, she was in the house grumbling about the work or other things that were not getting done. She would mumble about her broken fingernails or that not all her friends had agreed to come to the show. She fretted about the sure fact that not all judges are honorable, and therefore, if she didn't win, it was because someone on the panel was obviously a dumbbell, or even worse. Winston was in great distress. He had tried everything that he could to help Agatha. He wanted to be proud of her and her roses, and he wanted to love her round belly and her strength and her hard work. But he found that he could no longer find that love for her anywhere inside of him. He looked within his heart where he had always found it overflowing, and he looked in his mind where he had always kept it. He could not find it. Where did my love go? He asked himself. At that moment, he saw the sampler on the wall that Agatha had so carefully stitched. On a creamy white surface with letters of blue and violet, it said, "Love is its own reward." It reminded him that he could not let his friend Agatha down when she needed him the most. So he made up his mind that even though his distress over his feelings, or lack of feelings, was very difficult for him, he would do everything that he could to make Agatha's life just a little easier. If Agatha was upset over the dust in the sitting room, Winston would quietly pick up the dustcloth and go over each piece of furniture thoroughly, even though he had just dusted the room an hour before. If Agatha grumbled at the sourness of the cream in her tea, he would run, in his floppy sort of way, to the store on the corner and get her fresh cream, even if he had just purchased cream that morning. Winston tried to think of things that Agatha would need even before she muttered about them. While she floated in the tub, he would take the spray bottle to the garden and mist the roses. To keep the few remaining bees happy, he would stop and pet them, even though it felt very odd to him to rub their backs as they buzzed from flower to flower. When he felt especially unhappy, or Agatha was especially thoughtless to him, Winston would remind himself of their silent, sweet secret, and continue to act as lovingly to Agatha as he could. Finally, the day of the flower show arrived. Agatha waited till the sun was just peeking over the hills with its round red face before she cut her prize rose. She had stayed up all night watching over the rose so that no wayward bug would make its way up the stalk, past the thorns, and have its breakfast within and on the petals. Winston had stayed up all night too, making hot tea and bringing blankets to keep Agatha warm. She had thanked him, but from a very far-away place inside of her, instead of the close, warm thanks that she had given him in the past when he had been so kind. Winston, as had often happened in the past few weeks, would feel the tears well up inside of him, and sometimes a tiny wet spot would appear on his furry cheek if he wasn't fast enough in wiping it away. However, he continued to act as lovingly as he could, expecting nothing in return. For Winston knew that somewhere within himself he loved Agatha, even if this bear did not act like the Agatha he knew before the flower show visitor. The rose that Agatha picked was lovely. It was a bright yellow with an edging of pink on the outside petals and a deep rose center. The colors were perfect, but Agatha didn't really notice. All she could see was the tiny water spot that had discolored one of the petals, or the uneven row of thorns. Still, she knew that her rose would win. She knew that she had the best flower of them all. The show didn't begin until noon, and since the park was only a 10-minute walk away, Agatha and Winston spent the morning waiting. They waited at the breakfast table. No one spoke. Then they waited on the porch, Agatha on the wooden swing and Winston in his favorite chair. The only sound was the strain of the swing's chain. Once in a while, the clink of a spoon against a tree saucer could be heard, but never, in all the years that they had been together, had they spent an hour in such lonely silence while sitting together. This was not their favorite kind of silence, the silence when each of them was busy with their thoughts that they could then share with each other. This was a cold silence, as each was busy only with personal thoughts, busy with thoughts they had no intention of sharing. Agatha had her thoughts of winning mixed with the fear of losing, and Winston had his thoughts of sorrow over missing his Agatha and wondering if she would ever return to him. The Agatha of the past month was a stranger to him. In truth, Agatha was now a stranger to herself. When the time approached, Agatha removed the rose that she had kept in the refrigerator and placed it carefully into a bucket filled with ice, The walk to the park was the longest walk she had ever taken. She could hear the sounds of the people gathering for the show, and it felt as if her heart would burst out of her dress, it was pounding so hard. For days, her usually happy stomach had been very unhappy, full of bouncing and churning, and today was the worst day of all. At the show, her rose was taken from her, labeled, and placed on display. All that was left for her to do was wait. She didn't feel like looking at the rest of the show, so she and Winston selected a bench nearby to wait out the time until the winners were announced. Since Agatha and Winston weren't talking to each other, it was easy to hear what the people around them were saying. At first, neither of them paid much attention to the conversations because they were so self-absorbed. But finally, they began to hear the words that caused them to sit up and listen. The conversations of the people passing by were full of talk about the show. They talked about how beautiful the flowers were, and particularly how many entries there had been in the rose category. "Isn't it amazing," someone said, "that so many amateur rose growers have taken so much time to grow such beautiful roses when everyone knows that the sponsor of the show has already won?" There seemed to be no doubt in anyone's mind that the winner was chosen before the show. As they listened, in growing anger and astonishment, Winston and Agatha learned that there actually wasn't any show at all. The show was just a pretense, so that the sponsor could gather the perfect audience in which to announce his newest rose, a rose that was expected to be more beautiful and more successful than any rose ever grown before. Agatha and Winston sat motionlessly. Neither one of them had spoken or moved while they listened to the talk swirling around them. Each one of them felt anger, disappointment, frustration, and grief. The most dreadful thing of all was that they were afraid to look at each other and share their feelings. All the silent weeks that had gone by had kept them so separate, neither knew how to begin to share again. Agatha's thoughts tumbled inside her head. She thought of the weeks that she had spent preparing for the show. How dare they, she thought. Why didn't our visitor explain that it was only a showcase for the rose grower? I wasted a whole month getting ready. She thought of the digging and feeding and the late nights worrying. Finally, she began to realize that not once in that whole time had she enjoyed her garden, the roses, the bees, the sun on her head, or the rain through the trees. With a great start, she realized that most of all, she had not enjoyed Winston. Great tears rose in her eyes as she remembered all that he had done for her and how little she had noticed or been thankful for. Within her round, plump belly, she felt the sorrow that Winston must have felt, and she did not know how to contain her grief. With her eyes closed, she thought of their silent, sweet secret and how she had forgotten its value. At last, she opened her eyes. Kneeling in front of her, with her rose in his hand, was her Winston. For the first time since the visitor, Agatha looked into his eyes and saw herself reflected there. Winston could barely contain his joy as he looked back into her eyes and saw his Agatha once again. He looked into his heart and felt his love for her. He looked within his mind and found once again his thoughts of love. He knew he had kept the silent, sweet secret safe and had proved its truth again. To love just one person with all your heart and soul was much more valuable than any prize in any show in any place in the world. Hand in hand, they set out for home. Winston with a slightly wavy walk, and Agatha all round and full of giggles and laughter, each delighted with the other, themselves and their world and their simple and so sweet secret. The end. Love's Silent Sweet Secret, written by Becca Lewis. Copyright 1988. Audio by Becca Lewis. Copyright 2018.